The question of when the ancient Greeks started worshipping the 12 Olympians seems simple, but the answer is a fascinating, multi layered story that unfolds over 1,000 years. It reveals that while the gods themselves are ancient, their famous Club of 12 is a surprisingly late invention. The historical consensus, pieced together from archaeology, linguistics, and literature, presents us with two distinct timelines. The first tracks the worship of individual gods who would later be called Olympians, and it takes us deep into the Bronze Age. The second, much shorter timeline marks the moment these deities were first venerated together as a specific, canonical group of 12. Our journey begins around 1400 BC with the Mycenaeans, the first Greek-speaking civilization. For decades, our knowledge of them was limited to their mighty citadels and Homer's epic tales. But the decipherment of their script, Linear B, in the 1950s was a revelation. On these tablets, among inventories of chariots and personnel, were the names of gods receiving offerings. These tablets contain precursor gods to Zeus, Hera, Athena, Hermes, Ares, and Dionysus, the latter of whom was once thought to be a late import to Greece. This is proof that worship of these individual deities was a serious, state-sponsored enterprise centuries before they were ever imagined residing together on Mount Olympus. What's more, this early pantheon wasn't a mirror image of its later classical form. The divine hierarchy was different. At one location, Zeus wasn't the chief god, but Poseidon. And he wasn't just the lord of the sea, he was a far more primal entity. Poseidon was known as the Earth Shaker, and it's believed that ancient Greeks also thought he was responsible for earthquakes. This tells us that the relationships between the gods were fluid, their prominence varying by time and place. Zeus's undisputed reign wasn't a given. It was a position he would have to win in the religious imagination of the Greeks over the following centuries. This religious system was itself a hybrid, born from the encounter between the incoming Indo-European Greeks and the pre-existing Minoan civilization on Crete. When the Mycenaean palaces collapsed around 1100 BC, this centralized, bureaucratic world vanished, plunging Greece into a dark age. The art of writing was lost, but the gods were not. Their cults survived, albeit in a more localized and fragmented form. This period of transformation was crucial, for it was out of this cultural reset that the foundations for a unified or pan-Hellenic Greek identity were laid. Two forces were instrumental in this process. The first was literary. Around the 8th century BC, the poets Homer and Hesiod emerged. They didn't invent the gods, but they organized them. Hesiod's Theogony provided a definitive family tree, narrating the gods' origins and their war against the Titans. This gave the ultimate triumph that established Zeus as the undisputed king of the gods. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey gave the gods the distinct, flawed, and all too human personalities we recognize today. These epics, recited at festivals across the Greek-speaking world, created a shared mythology, a common religious language that transcended local differences. The second force was the rise of great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries. At Olympia, a site with religious activity stretching back into the Bronze Age, the Olympic Games were established in 776 BC to honor Zeus, making it the center of his worship. At Delphi, a sanctuary was dedicated to Apollo around 800 BC, and this site became home to the most powerful oracle in the ancient world. These sites became centers of a common faith, physical places where the myths codified by the poets were monumentalized in stone and celebrated by all Greeks. The myths gave meaning to the sanctuaries, and the sanctuaries lent authority to the myths. Yet, even with this growing Panhellenism, there was still no formal concept of the 12. That final step came relatively late. The first concrete evidence for a cult of the 12 appears in Athens around 522 BC. This was with the establishment of the Altar of the 12 Gods in the city's central agora. This act, likely a political move by the ruling class, created a civic and religious focal point for the developing city-state. The number 12 itself was deeply symbolic, echoing cosmic order, the months of the year, the signs of the zodiac, and suggesting a complete and balanced pantheon. But this group was never perfectly rigid, and the list of members could vary, with Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, often being swapped out for the more dynamic Dionysus. For reasons that should resonate with modern audiences, Dionysus was a fan favorite amongst the gods even back then. The answer to when the Greeks started to worship the 12 is a tale of two beginnings. They began worshiping the individual gods we call Olympians in the Bronze Age, with clear evidence by 1400 BC. But they only began worshiping them as a formal collective group known as the 12 nearly 1,000 years later, in the late 6th century BC. Still, this is simply as far as the evidence takes us at present, and it's possible that in the future we will find further evidence to indicate the worship of the 12 Olympians is even older. It's the most famous statue on the planet, a creature of myth and stone that has stared out at the rising sun for millennia. But the Great Sphinx of Giza wasn't built in the way we usually imagine. It wasn't constructed block by block like the colossal pyramids it guards. Instead, it was revealed. It's a piece of the Giza Plateau itself, a single massive outcrop of limestone that ancient hands carved into a living form. This geological fact is the key to its entire story, a story that has become one of archaeology's most heated debates. For millennia, people from the ancient Egyptians themselves to modern scholars have asked who exactly gave this hunk of limestone its form and shape. The mainstream historical consensus, backed by a mountain of archaeological evidence, points to one man, the 4th dynasty pharaoh Khafre, who ruled around 2500 BC. In this view, the Sphinx was the final magnificent flourish of the Giza necropolis, a guardian for his pyramid complex. The argument for Khafre is built not on a single inscription, but on a web of interlocking physical evidence. It insists that the Sphinx cannot be understood as a standalone monument, but only as an integral, final piece of a grand architectural vision. The Giza Plateau wasn't developed haphazardly, but rather, it was a carefully planned sacred landscape. Under this theory, the Sphinx is deliberately positioned within Khafre's portion of it, a guardian aligned with his pyramid and temples. The most powerful evidence lies in the construction sequence, the literal order in which things were built. The Sphinx sits in a quarry. The southern wall of this quarry cuts directly through the foundation of the stone causeway that connects Khafre's pyramid to his valley temple. It proves that the causeway had to have been built before the quarry around the Sphinx was fully excavated. This simple, unchangeable fact places the Sphinx's creation squarely within the timeline of Khafre's reign. Furthermore, the two temples directly in front of the Sphinx Temple and Khafre's Valley Temple, are architecturally and geologically bound to it. They sit on the same prepared terrace and share an almost identical design for their inner courts, a style unique to Khafre's era and distinct from that of his father, Khufu. The link becomes unbreakable thanks to the work of archaeologist Mark Lehner. Through a process of geological analysis, his team demonstrated that the limestone blocks used to build the core of the Sphinx Temple were quarried directly from where the Sphinx sits. By mapping the unique fossil content and layers, or strata, of the bedrock, They showed that the layers in the temple blocks perfectly match the layers in the walls of the Sphinx enclosure. This provides a direct physical chain of custody. The act of carving the Sphinx out of the bedrock simultaneously produced the building materials for its temple. This leads to another crucial point. Both the Sphinx and its temple were never fully finished. The temple walls lack their final granite casing, and quarrying in the enclosure appears to have been abandoned abruptly. This strongly suggests the Sphinx complex was the very last element in Khafra's massive building program, likely interrupted by his death after a reign of about 25 years. This detail elegantly solves one of the biggest supposed mysteries, the lack of Old Kingdom texts claiming Khafra as the builder. In essence, if a building wasn't formally completed, it would never be dedicated, and if it wasn't dedicated, there's a vastly reduced chance we'd know who commissioned it. The mainstream consensus holds that the face on the Sphinx is an idealized portrait of Khafra himself. This is supported by the statue's context and by the discovery of a magnificent life-size statue of Khafra in his nearby valley temple. The Sphinx wears the royal headdress, a symbol exclusive to the pharaoh, cementing its role as a representation of divine kingship. The fusion of a lion's body, symbolizing raw power, with a king's head, symbolizing intellect and control, was a potent expression of the pharaoh's divine nature. However, some scholars suggest that the face bears a stronger resemblance to Khufu, his father, and may have been built in his honor. That said, ancient Egyptian royal depictions weren't about photorealistic accuracy. They were about projecting an idealized, divine image of the king. Despite the weight of archaeological evidence, alternative theories about the Sphinx's origin remain popular. The most prominent is the water erosion hypothesis, championed by American geologist Robert Schoch. He argues that the deep, vertical weathering on the Sphinx's body and its enclosure walls could only have been caused by thousands of years of heavy rainfall. If he is correct in his hypothesis, this would push its construction back to a much wetter period around 5000 BC. However, mainstream geologists offer a more direct explanation: salt weathering. For the overwhelming majority of its history, the Sphinx's body was buried in sand. Moisture from rain and groundwater absorbed up into the porous limestone, dissolving natural salts within the rock. As the stone dried, these salts recrystallized and expanded, causing the surface to flake off in a pattern that perfectly mimics water erosion. In general, this theory and others have not received any mainstream historical acceptance. Other theories suggest that the Sphinx is even older, though these theories are taken much less seriously than the water erosion hypothesis. After the fall of the Old Kingdom, it was largely abandoned and slowly consumed by the desert. By 1400 BC, more than 1,000 years after its creation, it was buried up to its neck in sand, a forgotten relic of a bygone age. Its history was dramatically rebooted by a young prince who would become Pharaoh Thutmose IV. As recorded on the granite dream stele he later erected between its paws, the prince fell asleep in the Sphinx's shadow and had a powerful dream. The statue spoke to him, promising him the throne of Egypt if he would clear away the sand that was choking it. Thutmose fulfilled his vow, excavating the monument and building a temple around it. In doing so, he gave the Sphinx a second life. It was transformed from a piece of funerary architecture into a major deity in its own right, an object of pilgrimage and worship for centuries to come. The Sphinx we know today, the wise speaking god of the desert, is almost entirely a product of this new kingdom reinvention. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just taking a second to remind you to hit the notification bell and turn on all notifications for my channel. Also, don't forget that you can support my work for as little as $1 a month through the YouTube membership or a bit more through Patreon. In the year 166 AD, a group of men claiming to be envoys from a distant Western king arrived at the court of Emperor Huan of China's Han Dynasty. They had traveled by sea, landing in the southern province of Renan, modern-day Vietnam, before being escorted to the capital, Luoyang. Their king, they said, was named Andun, a name Chinese historians recognized as a plausible transliteration of Antoninus. This almost certainly referred to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the philosopher-emperor of Rome. This single, strange encounter, documented only in Chinese records and debated by historians ever since, is the perfect entry point into one of history's most fascinating non-relationships. It encapsulates the entire story of Han China and Imperial Rome, two colossal empires. They were the twin anchors of ancient Eurasia, aware of each other's existence but separated by such vast gulfs of distance, culture, and competing powers. At their height in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty were remarkably similar in scale and structure. Both were vast, multi-ethnic states controlling immense territories and populations, building extensive road networks, and fielding powerful armies to deal with frontier barbarians. They were the two poles of the civilized world as they knew it, the endpoints of a sprawling network of exchange that snaked across the continent. Yet for all their parallel might, the modern historical consensus is clear. Their relationship was almost exclusively indirect. There were no treaties, no conflicts, and no sustained diplomatic contact. Instead, their story is one of mediated exchange, where goods, ideas, and perceptions were filtered through a long chain of intermediary cultures. In the absence of firm knowledge, each empire constructed a version of the other that served its own cultural and political narratives. Through this, they created a relationship built less on reality and more on mutual myth-making. The popular image of a single Silk Road is a convenient fiction. In reality, the connection was a complex and branching network of caravan trails and maritime routes. The overland journey wasn't a single trip, but a relay trade, where goods changed hands many times in the bustling oasis cities of Central Asia, like Samarkand and Bukhara. A merchant leaving the Han capital of Chang'an would likely travel only as far as the Tarim Basin, selling his goods to a Sogdian trader. That trader might carry them to the Kushan Empire in modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, who in turn would trade with the Parthians in Persia. This system ensured that goods arrived at their final destination stripped of their original context, and information arrived as fragmented accounts. The 5,000 miles separating the capitals were a landscape of extreme peril, from the treacherous mountain passes of the Pamirs to the vast, unforgiving Taklamakan Desert. While the overland routes are more famous, a crucial maritime alternative existed. Roman sailors, having learned to harness the monsoon winds, established a lively sea trade connecting Roman Egypt with the ports as far away as Sri Lanka. From there, goods could continue on to Southeast Asia and the southern Chinese port of Guangzhou. The discovery of a Roman glass bowl in a Guangzhou tomb dating to the early 1st century BC provides concrete proof of this sea route's ancient importance. The lack of direct contact wasn't just a result of distance, but an active outcome of geopolitical strategy, primarily orchestrated by the Parthian Empire. Geographically positioned between the two superpowers, the Parthians, along with the Kushans, controlled the most critical junctures of the Silk Road. They fully understood that their immense wealth depended on their monopoly as intermediaries. They were gatekeepers who actively worked to prevent direct contact between their two biggest customers. Chinese sources are explicit on this point, noting that Parthia was often a difficulty, but that they couldn't do much about it. The most potent example of this strategy is the story of the Chinese envoy Gan Ying in 97 AD. Sent by the great Han general Ban Chao on a mission to finally establish contact with Rome, Gan Ying made it as far as Mesopotamia, on the shores of the Persian Gulf. He was on the cusp of entering Roman territory, but there, Parthian sailors, eager to protect their lucrative position, deliberately misled him. They spun tales of a perilous sea voyage that could take up to 2 years with unfavorable winds, a journey so long and disheartening that many men died of homesickness. Discouraged, Gan Ying turned back, unaware that he was likely just a few weeks' overland journey from the Roman frontier in Syria. This single masterful act of disinformation successfully thwarted China's most serious attempt to reach Rome. The trade that flowed across this fragmented network wasn't in necessities, but in highly specialized luxury goods that one empire excelled at producing. For Rome, the ultimate prize was silk. The translucent, shimmering fabric became a sensation, a symbol of wealth and status so potent that it sparked a moral panic. Conservative writers like Seneca the Younger railed against silk garments, which were often rewoven to be sheer, as symbols of decadence and effeminacy. To these writers, the silk fabrics would have disgusted the rugged men of the Republican era, like Cincinnatus or Scipio Africanus. Officials, on the other hand, worried about the massive outflow of Roman wealth to pay for it, creating a severe trade deficit. For the Han elite, the most coveted Roman products were high-quality glassware from the workshops of Alexandria and Syria. Far superior to anything produced locally, these items became powerful status symbols. Archaeologists have unearthed Roman glass bowls, beads, and gilded silver plates in the tombs of Han princes and nobles, providing the physical footprints of this long-distance exchange. This trade reveals a fascinating truth. The two empires were technological equals in different domains. In the absence of direct contact, each empire constructed a fantastical image of the other, revealing more about themselves than their distant counterparts. Roman knowledge was hazy at best. Authors like Pliny the Elder described what he called the Silk People in vague, often mythical terms. They were portrayed as a peaceful, just, and civilized people who lived to a great age and shunned direct contact with outsiders. In his telling, these silk people were willing to leave their goods for trade in a desert spot, which clearly speaks to the reality of the handover on the Chinese frontier. Pliny's famous misconception that silk was a fleecy product combed from the leaves of trees perfectly illustrates the profound lack of first-hand knowledge. The fact that silk was produced from worms at all may have shocked the Romans. Chinese accounts primarily are more detailed but equally idealized. They called the Roman Empire Dakin, suggesting they saw Rome as a civilized counterpart to their own empire. In the mind of the Chinese elite, it was a kind of mirror image China at the other end of the world. They claimed that the people from this land were tall and honest, and also looked exactly like Chinese people. Some believe that it may have been implicit to the ancient Chinese that the Romans were some sort of ancient Chinese lost colony. However, there's no proof of this. Most strikingly, Rome was described as having a utopian political system where rulers were not hereditary, but chosen for their merit. If the kingdom suffered from calamities, the king was unceremoniously deposed and would accept his demotion without anger. Notably, while some have viewed this as a description of the system of consuls, most historians don't believe this to be the case. Instead, it's thought that this was a perfect projection of idealized Confucian values onto a distant, unknown land. In a Confucian system, if a ruler loses the mandate of heaven, the worst thing he can do is fight against it. It's like swimming against a riptide. The Romans, being distant and powerful, could serve as a model for how the Chinese believed they themselves should ideally behave. The stable political conditions that sustained even this indirect connection began to unravel in the 3rd century AD. The Han dynasty collapsed into a long period of conflict very famously known as the Three Kingdoms period. The Roman Empire entered its own protracted crisis, eventually leading to its fragmentation. The collapse of these two imperial anchors made the long-distance trade routes far more dangerous and less profitable. While trade never ceased entirely, the grand scale of exchange seen at the height of the two empires diminished significantly. The thread connecting the two ends of Eurasia had frayed, and a meaningful attempt to restart relations wouldn't start again until the 7th century. However, by that time, the Roman Empire only persisted in the east, and China was under the rule of the powerful Tang dynasty.